Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 39 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I produce these episodes so that they will stand alone to the extent possible, meaning I want new listeners to be able to tune in and get something out of them, even if they haven't listened to all the previous episodes. If you're tuning in for the first time and you get confused because you don't have enough context, that context can be found in earlier episodes. This episode in particular is a two-parter, so I recommend that at the very least, if you haven't listened to episode 38, you go back and do that first. If you already know this story well and you don't need that background, then by all means stick around. Last time, I covered the East German refugee crisis of 1989, as Hungary dismantled its border barriers with Austria, leading to a mass exodus of East Germans hoping to escape to the west through Hungary, only to, for the most part, find the way closed. Today, the effects of that crisis will boil over back home in East Germany, culminating in the most symbolic moment of the end of the Cold War. This is The End of History, Part 39. Growing up in the United States, one of the quasi-mythological pieces of American history that I was steeped in school was the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. I say that it's quasi-mythological not because anything about it is fake, but because the version I was steeped in was, at best, an oversimplified story, framed in a way calculated to cast America in the best possible light. The version of history I was taught in school is that the racial inequality in the United States was an obvious aberration, not representative in general of our history, and that Martin Luther King Jr. came along in the 1960s and fixed racism, so everything is fine now, and we can all get along. It's somewhat embarrassing for me to admit that this is more or less what I believed growing up. I was well into adulthood studying U.S. history in college when I first looked deeper at this history with a more critical eye. I still believe deeply in the stated founding ideals of the United States, and that racism is fundamentally incompatible with those ideas. But I no longer believe that our history of racism is a mere bug in an otherwise perfect system. It's just a lot more complicated than that. Racism was baked into the fabric of our society from the very beginning, and a huge part of the story of America is the story of the struggle between our national ethos of freedom and equality and the philosophy of white supremacy that reflected the practical structure of our society. So many philosophers in early American history spent countless hours of writing trying to understand this contradiction or justify it and explain how and why extreme racial inequality and oppression, like race-based chattel slavery, were not really contradictions of our values. Others still simply accepted the contradiction and chose the other side, rejecting the founding values altogether in favor of white supremacy. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, for example, famously said in his 1861 Cornerstone speech that Thomas Jefferson's proposition that all men are created equal was, quote, an error, end quote. The American Civil War was a conflict between these two competing visions of America, and the triumph of the North in that conflict dealt a decisive blow in favor of equality. But white supremacy didn't simply go away after the war. The civil rights movement was, in large part, the unfinished business of that conflict, delayed a century by Jim Crow segregation. One of the more remarkable things about the civil rights movement that I think is often overlooked is the tremendous discipline it took for the demonstrators to remain passive and peaceful in the face of violent resistance from police and counter-demonstrators. The brave souls who marched in Selma on Bloody Sunday, for example, knew they were not going to be allowed to register to vote in Alabama that day. They knew they were going to face terrible violence for having the temerity to try and exercise their constitutionally guaranteed right to vote. They knew going into it what was going to happen to them, and that was the point. I don't know if any of you have ever been beaten with a billy club, pepper sprayed, and sprayed with a fire hose, but it takes tremendous discipline and restraint not to fight back when that happens to you. I have attended my fair share of protests, and I can tell you that such perfect discipline among protesters is almost impossible. And unfortunately, I also know from experience that when you attend a demonstration and one person breaks a window or lights a trash can on fire, even if there were 100,000 people demonstrating lawfully and peacefully, that one act of violence becomes the face of the entire protest. Even in situations where both the protesters and police are well-intentioned, it's almost impossible to maintain perfect peace and order in a situation where there is a standoff between police and demonstrators. In my experience, it's almost guaranteed that someone on one side or the other is going to get nervous and let the heat of the moment get the best of them. One of the protesters hurls a water bottle, or one of the officers fires a tear gas canister, and at that point, the whole situation turns. The protesters fight back, more tear gas is fired, people are beaten and arrested. The whole thing blows up. I've seen it happen, and it's a difficult thing to describe to a person who's never seen a crowd turn. There's a sociological phenomenon there. There's a point of no return, like the event horizon of a black hole, after which nobody, not the protest leaders, not the police, not anybody can turn it back around. It gains a life of its own, and what is most remarkable is how quickly that happens. This sort of thing did happen during the protests of the Civil Rights Movement, but to me, who has experienced it firsthand, it's remarkably impressive how rare such turnings of the crowd were. Again, it shows tremendous discipline. They kept their eyes on the prize, which, not so coincidentally, is the title of an excellent documentary on the Civil Rights Movement that I highly recommend to anyone listening to my podcast. The American Civil Rights Movement was and continues to be a source of inspiration to protest movements all around the world. One such movement was the Prayers for Peace, centered in Leipzig, East Germany, beginning in the early 1980s. And just like that, as I always do, I've reached my point. The American Civil Rights Movement was largely built around African American churches, largely because that was one of the few places where authorities could not stop activists from congregating. The same can be said of dissidents in East Germany. I discussed religion in the Soviet Union back in episode 24, and the experience was pretty similar in most Eastern Bloc countries, created as they were in the image of the USSR, minus, of course, the significant impact of Islam, which was far less significant in Eastern and Central Europe than it was in the USSR. But overall, while these countries were governed by Marxist regimes that were hostile toward traditional religion, religious faith was too deeply ingrained in the culture of the people of these countries to be stamped out entirely, and so religious faith was reluctantly tolerated by the state. Instead of seeking to destroy the church, the state sought to influence and control it. In the USSR, it was the Russian Orthodox Church that predominated. In East Germany, it was the Lutheran and Catholic churches. While, especially after the rise of the anti-communist Pole, John Paul II, to the papacy, the Catholic Church became increasingly subversive to communist regimes, the high degree of centralization in the Catholic Church made it easier for authorities to infiltrate and control, whereas the Protestant Lutheran Church was, by its very nature, decentralized. Thus, at least early on, it was in the Lutheran churches of East Germany that dissident movements began to congregate and organize. Specifically, it was in the Lutheran St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig, where the strongest peaceful dissident movement in East Germany was born. One East German later remembered, quote, "There was no head of the revolution. The head was the St. Nicholas Church, and the body the center of the city. There was only one leadership, Monday, 5 p.m., St. Nicholas Church." End quote. In 1982, the church pastor, Christian Führer, who had an unfortunate last name, but I promise had nothing to do with a different German man who also was called Führer, began saying prayers for peace at St. Nicholas weekly on Monday nights. This may not seem like a huge deal, but Cold War-era East Germany was one of the most repressive states of the period, and open criticism of the regime would never have been tolerated. These prayers for peace were a subtle protest against the militarism and insanity of the Cold War, and they drew to them people dissatisfied with the status quo. At first, these prayer meetings were small, consisting of only about a dozen people. In 1985, Pastor Führer placed signs outside the church, telling anyone who saw that all were welcome inside. Again, sending a subtle message that the church was an open space where people could meet and discuss things that could not be discussed in the rest of the country. By 1987, these prayers for peace were no longer just Lutheran prayer meetings, but attracted Catholics and atheists as well, anybody who was dissatisfied with the regime and wanted to discuss it with like-minded people. Still, in the mid-1980s, these prayer circles were relatively small and thoroughly infiltrated and monitored by agents of the Stasi. Like religion in general, the state sought to keep it under control rather than snuff it out altogether. And as long as it was small enough to effectively monitor and control, this movement was just not seen as a threat and was largely ignored by the authorities. In 1988, Pastor Fuhrer, who had started the movement, actually grew dissatisfied with the open politicization of the peace prayer circles as they came together to raise money for the defense of a young man arrested for spray painting quotes of Mikhail Gorbachev on walls around the city. Pastor Fuhrer broke from the movement, but by this time it had grown beyond his control. As the refugee crisis of 1989 escalated and frustration with the regime mounted, these peace prayers now became the focal point of a growing movement for peaceful revolution. On September 4th, 1989, the prayer in the church morphed into a public protest for the first time, when following the prayer service, two dissidents spilled out into the adjacent Karl Marx Square and unfurled a banner reading, quote, "For an open country with free people," end quote. Others from the prayer service joined them in the square to publicly demonstrate against the regime. These protests became a weekly event, as every Monday following the prayer for peace at St. Nicholas, crowds would spill into the square to protest against the regime. These crowds grew in size steadily every week, and on October 2nd, 1989, a crowd of approximately 10,000 attempted to march from Karl Marx Square around the Ring Road in central Leipzig. On this occasion, they were met with armed police blocking the road, and rather than confront them, the crowd turned back. But leaders immediately began to plot an even bigger march along the same route for the following week. Like the leaders of the civil rights marches in the United States, the leaders of these marches understood that they would likely be met with violence. Indeed, that violence was likely to be deadly, and perfect discipline was necessary to keep the march peaceful and prevent the regime from having a PR excuse to kill them all. Later that week, on October 4th, riots occurred in the nearby city of Dresden, as mobs of people attempted to rush and board the freedom trains headed for West Germany from Czechoslovakia, which I talked about last time. Reports from the authorities noted that 45 policemen were injured in Dresden that night. The reports did not note how many of the crowd were injured, but it's almost certain that it was in the hundreds, if not higher. Frustration in the country was boiling over. Escape had always at least been a hope in the back of people's minds when they were dissatisfied with their government. But with the borders now completely closed as a result of the refugee crisis and the freedom trains, open protest now seemed a more viable option to many. Both protesters and police prepared for a clash on October 9th in Leipzig. The General Secretary of the East German Communist Party, Erich Honecker, had been publicly praising the massacre of pro-democracy protesters by Chinese authorities in Tiananmen Square earlier that year, and strongly hinted that he favored a similar response in his own country. Indeed, Honecker did issue orders to his police and National Guard forces in Leipzig that if demonstrators attempted to push past barriers erected to stop them on October 9th, they should open fire with live ammunition. In normal times, that might have been the end of it, and we probably would have seen a massacre of the protesters that day. But there was internal turmoil in the East German party at that particular moment. Honecker's handling of the refugee crisis and his proposal around the freedom trains in particular, as well as his frequent absence due to medical issues, had caused many in the party's inner circle to lose faith in him. Honecker had instructed one of his deputies, Egon Krenz, who was generally in charge of security matters on the party central committee, to travel to Leipzig and oversee operations there. Krenz seems to have believed that Honecker was setting him up as the scapegoat so that after the massacre, the blame could be placed on him and Honecker could escape the situation with his hands clean. And it seems that at this point, Krenz, rather than traveling to Leipzig as he was instructed, began to form alliances with other high-ranking party members in a plot to push Honecker out. Thus, on the night of October 9th, as the protest in Leipzig unfolded, the loyalties of the party leadership were divided, and nobody seemed to know who was actually in charge, leading to confusion among the police. The protesters knew none of this, and many of them spent the days leading up to October 9th making or revising their wills, fearing the very real possibility that they would be killed by the police. Indeed, many local Leipzig police were aware that orders had been issued to fire on protesters with live ammunition, and they quietly warned their friends and families to stay away. Honecker ordered the local police reinforced with police and National Guard units from other parts of the country, fearing that local officers might be hesitant to murder their friends and neighbors. And yet, despite the widespread rumors of an impending massacre, a conservative estimate places the number at least 40,000 people who turned out to protest against the regime in Leipzig on October 9th, far exceeding the numbers expected by the authorities. Helmut Hockenberg, the Leipzig party second secretary, who was personally in command of the police on the ground that evening, estimated the number to be around 100,000. For context, Leipzig had a population at that time of just around 500,000. When the crowd poured into the street, they began to march on Leipzig's Central Ring Road, chanting various slogans, including "We are the people," and they soon came to the first of several barricades set up by police and security forces to stop them at a strategic curve in the road. The police were vastly outnumbered, and even with all their guns, it would have been impracticable to try and stop the protesters if they made it past that point. As the crowd approached, Hockenberg, though he had days earlier been given orders directly from Erich Honecker to fire on the crowd, was now no longer sure who was really in charge, and he chose to phone Berlin and confirm these orders with Egon Krenz, the Central Committee secretary in charge of security. Hockenberg managed to get Krenz on the phone and informed him that he had conferred with the head of Leipzig police, Roland Wurzel, and that any attempt to stop the protest would, quote, "certainly not be bloodless," end quote. He conveyed that given the size of the crowd, it was possible that not only protesters but policemen would be killed in the clash. He advised Krenz that they should stand down and let the protesters pass. Krenz told Hockenberg that he could not confirm any order to stand down. He said he needed to consult with someone and would call Hockenberg back. It's unclear who he needed to consult with. As Hockenberg waited for Krenz to call back, the crowd was getting closer to his position. He waited as long as he could to hear back from Krenz, but as the crowd neared his position, he had to make a judgment call. He ordered his forces to take a defensive posture and fight back with all means if attacked, but if not attacked, to stand down and let the protesters pass. He gave this order in direct contravention of prior orders from Erich Honecker, and this solidified the reality that Honecker was no longer in charge. As the protesters passed the checkpoint, it was like a massive collective sigh of relief was let out all over the city. Relief soon gave way to jubilation. Everyone there that night, police included, understood what it meant. There would be no German Tiananmen Square. One way or another, their country was about to change. Nothing could stop it now. It's a minor miracle that nobody let emotions or panic get the best of them that night. Nobody let the adrenaline of victory get their blood up and attacked or threatened a police officer, and none of the thousands of police officers got nervous and attacked a protester, sparking a clash. If they did, this might be a very different podcast episode. Some of the demonstrators even engaged in friendly conversation with police officers, and pretty soon the mood on the street was more like a celebration than a protest. The demonstrators marched all the way around Leipzig's Central Ring Road, and some had so much adrenaline from the victory that they started a second lap and marched around it again. A group of activists from East Berlin had managed to film the entire thing from a bell tower atop St. Nicholas Church, and managed to smuggle their footage to friends in West Berlin. And soon, the march was on every broadcast of the evening news throughout Europe and North America, including the West German broadcasts tuned into by East Germans. It was a momentous shift that the communist state could not hide from its people. Erich Honecker was deeply embarrassed by the incident, and when a new march took place a week later, he attempted to personally order the security forces to shoot the protesters. But at this point, his orders were simply ignored. 2 days later, on October 18th, Honecker was ambushed in a meeting of the Central Committee, with a motion for his removal from the post of General Secretary. And in a scene reminiscent of the 1964 coup against Nikita Khrushchev in the USSR, Honecker was forced to sit and listen for hours, as each voting member took a turn insulting and denouncing him. When it was all over, a true communist to the end, Honecker raised his hand and voted in favor of his own removal from office, making the vote unanimous. Egon Krenz was then unanimously voted in to replace him. Krenz had long aspired to the position, but now that he had gotten what he wanted, one has to wonder if he had any buyer's remorse. He inherited leadership of a country in the midst of an unprecedented crisis. He hoped he could walk a delicate line of enacting modest reforms to placate the increasingly revolutionary population, while avoiding changes so radical that they undermined the power and control of his authoritarian government. If this sounds familiar, it's the same struggle faced by all the Eastern Bloc leaders reacting to Gorbachev's perestroika. Krenz's East Germany was actually late to the party, which meant that the crisis had been allowed to build much more, and the danger was much greater. On November 1st, facing threats of a general workers' strike across the country, Krenz reopened Germany's border with Czechoslovakia, allowing East Germans to once again travel freely to their Warsaw Pact neighbor. Czechoslovakia was, after all, still governed by hardline communists, and Krenz probably trusted that they would not do anything to undermine him, as the Hungarians had. On November 4th, a massive protest took place in Berlin, which dwarfed the October 9th protest in Leipzig. Of course, it is important to note that the size of Berlin as a city dwarfed Leipzig. Nonetheless, when 500,000 people join any protest in any city, it's hard for the government not to take notice. Krenz took no action to stop the protest. 2 days later, on November 6th, his government released the text of a new travel law, meant to have the appearance of true reform while actually changing little. Under the text of the new law, citizens still had to apply for permission to travel abroad, which was issued by the same people that had made the decisions before. The only discernible difference was that the law mandated the decisions were supposed to be made, quote-unquote, quickly, but it didn't define what quickly meant. The law was overwhelmingly rejected by the population and actually led to more protests across the country, with thousands of people demonstrating for the right to travel freely to West Germany and elsewhere. Meanwhile, fearing the consequences of hosting yet more East German dissidents within their borders upsetting the apple cart, so to speak, Czechoslovakia informed Krenz that if he did not take immediate action, they would open their border with West Germany for East Germans to travel directly to the West without having to return to East Germany first. Krenz determined that a new travel law should be drafted that had more teeth to placate the crowds, but that still would not go all the way in just opening the border. He delegated this task to the party's vast bureaucracy. And so it was that at 9 a.m. on November 9, 1989, 3 relatively unimportant mid-level Communist Party bureaucrats, Gerhard Lauder, Gotthard Hubrecht, and Hans-Joachim Kruger, met to draft the text of this law. Their instructions from the Politburo were to draft a law that opened the border a little bit, but only for those wishing to permanently emigrate, not for those who wished to travel abroad and return. Their thinking on this seems to have been that such a law would allow the troublemakers to leave, and that good citizens would have no problem waiting for the proper permits to visit relatives in the West. But the 3 bureaucrats, when they met to discuss these orders, agreed that the instructions made no sense. Lauder reportedly put it to his fellow drafters, quote, "Everyone who wants to stay in the West is allowed to leave immediately, but the person who wants to come back to his work and his home is not allowed to go? We will drive the people out of the country." End quote. Lauder managed to convince his colleagues that if they followed the letter of their task, it would violate the spirit of their task, and so they made the decision to exceed their orders. Their orders had in fact been so specific that they had already been given the title of the new law. The permanent emigration of GDR citizens to the FRG, that is the Federal Republic of Germany or West Germany, via CSSR, that is the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. They kept this title, but then proceeded to change just about everything else about the law. The text of the law rendered the previous travel restrictions null and void. It announced that immediately, East Germans wishing to take private trips abroad could apply to do so without having to meet the onerous requirements that had previously been in place, though it did importantly say that they still had to apply for and receive government permission. Most importantly, the law also stated that effective immediately, permanent emigration could take place at all border crossings between East and West Germany, including West Berlin. I think it was likely assumed by the drafters that permission still needed to be granted for such emigration, but the law did not actually say this. It doesn't seem like these men really realized the gravity of what they had done. When they finished their work that evening, Lauder left the office and took his wife out for a romantic evening at the theater. When they returned home later that night, his son informed him that the Justice Ministry had been repeatedly trying to call him, and, quote, "Oh, by the way, the wall is open," end quote. The impetus for that momentous event came with a Western-style press conference given by the Central Committee's Secretary for Information, Günter Schabowski, to a pool of foreign correspondents in East Berlin, which included the famed American journalist Tom Brokaw, who had been sent to East Germany by NBC Nightly News in case word of a new travel law were to come about. Schabowski had been briefed by the Central Committee on the instructions given to the drafters of the law, and was unaware of the changes made to its substance. He had been handed a copy of the text of the new law, but did not, according to witnesses, bother to actually read it before taking it with him into the press conference, which began at 6 p.m. that evening. Brokaw later remembered that he did not expect to get much from Schabowski that evening. He had been to a number of his press conferences already, and the man usually spoke in vague Communist Party platitudes and rarely gave a straight answer to any reporter's question. But about an hour into the conference, an Italian journalist, Riccardo Ehrman, nonchalantly asked about travel opportunities for East Germans. Schabowski began his answer using the same party bureaucraties that he always spoke in, but after a few rambling sentences, informed the press pool that that very night the government was issuing a new law that would allow any citizen who wished to emigrate. Tom Brokaw, who did not speak German, recalled that even before his interpreter translated the sentence to him, he could hear audible gasps from the reporters in the room who did speak German, and he knew something important was happening. He said on a broadcast days later, quote, "It was as if an alien force from space had just invaded the room," end quote. He recalled that his interpreter whispered to him in English, quote, "It's the end of the Cold War," end quote. Ignoring a frenzy of questions from reporters, Schabowski pulled the draft text out of his pocket, which, as I mentioned, he had not previously read, and began to read aloud. When he finished, multiple reporters asked him repeatedly if a passport was required for travel. Since the text of the law did not specify, Schabowski simply didn't answer that question. When someone shouted out the question of when this law would take effect, he answered succinctly, quote, "Right away," end quote. More frenzied questions rang out across the room. Schabowski, seemingly rendered speechless, just stood motionless and silent for a few moments. Finally, Brokaw recalled somebody shouted out the question, quote, "What will happen with the Berlin Wall?" end quote. Schabowski answered, quote, "It has come to my attention that it is now 7 o'clock. This is the last question, yes? Please understand," end quote. And he hurriedly left the room, leaving echoes of more questions from the press filling the room behind him. Journalists then rushed to the phones to inform their bosses back home of the groundbreaking, though still confusing news. Immediately after the press conference, Schabowski sat down for a previously agreed interview with Tom Brokaw, which was conducted in English, a language that it is worth noting Schabowski did not speak fluently. I don't want to impugn anyone's language skills. It's not easy to learn a language. But it is important to know one's limitations. Schabowski's English was probably about as good as my Russian, which is to say, good enough for everyday conversation, but probably not good enough to give a news interview about such an important and complicated topic. When at the end of the interview, Brokaw asked him if the new law meant freedom of travel, Schabowski replied in English, quote, "Yes, of course. It is no question of tourism. It is a permission of leaving GDR," end quote. Those of you who, like me, a native speaker, are fluent in English, are probably thinking, huh? But when the answer, "yes, of course," was reported by the media, it was taken as a confirmation that the border with West Germany, including the Berlin Wall, was now open for free travel. The senior officer on duty on the East German side of the important Bornholmer crossing in the Berlin Wall that night, Harold Jaeger, was listening to the press conference on the radio from his post that evening. When he heard it, he immediately phoned his superiors for further instructions, but was told nothing had changed and he should continue enforcing the rules as usual. However, thousands of residents of East Berlin had also been listening, and they interpreted Schabowski's words the same way the press did. Almost immediately after the press conference concluded, a crowd began to gather at the Bornholmer crossing, and the other crossing points along the Berlin Wall as well, demanding to cross into West Berlin. By 8:30 that evening, Jaeger reported the crowd gathered at Bornholmer was in the hundreds and constantly growing. By 9 o'clock, the crowd was in the thousands, and some of the more bold individuals in the crowd were starting to become aggressive, drawing attention to themselves, riling the crowd up, and sparking very real fears among the guards manning the wall that they would be attacked. Jaeger phoned his superiors again, this time expressing alarm and asking for new orders. He was instructed to quietly usher the troublemakers through, but to stamp the picture on their passports so that they were marked invalid and they could not be allowed back through the wall. This tactic backfired, however, as when the crowd saw the loudest, most aggressive members of the crowd being allowed through the wall, the rest of the crowd grew more agitated, and more began acting aggressively, hoping that this would result in them too being allowed through the wall. At about 10:15, Jaeger was summoned by his West German counterpart on the other side of the checkpoint to deal with the situation. Two of the people who had been let through but marked with invalidated passports earlier were the parents of a young child. They had never intended to leave permanently and had to get home to care for their child. They were incredibly emotional, pleading with Jaeger to let them come back through. At this point, frustrated with the lack of guidance or support he had received from his superiors, and taking pity on the young couple, Jaeger disobeyed his orders and allowed the couple to come back through the wall and go home. He later told an interviewer that at this point, he thought since he had already disobeyed his orders, he might as well go a little further, and he allowed several others at the checkpoint seeking re-entry to come back through as well. At this point, the wall was still not open, and the great mass of the crowd was still not being let through. At around 11:15 p.m. that night, Jaeger reported to his superiors that the crowd at the Bornholmer crossing was in the tens of thousands, but he was told that his orders were unchanged. He overheard someone at Stasi headquarters asking his direct superior if he was a coward, which he took great offense to. It also made him realize that nobody was going to lift a finger to help him. The higher-ups were not even acknowledging that they were dealing with a crisis. At this point, Jaeger made a fateful decision. He later said that the way he saw it, there were two choices. He could order his men to open fire on the crowd, in which case they would not only be murderers, but would probably take casualties of their own, and they might be swamped anyway. His other option was to give the order to stand down and open the gate. At approximately 11:30 p.m., without bothering to ask for instructions from his superiors, Jaeger conferred with his men to get a sense of where they stood, and gave the order to open the gate and stand down. The crowd rushed through, and the Berlin Wall was at last open, never to be closed again. As word of what had happened at Bornholmer spread around the city, guards took similar action without orders at most of the major crossing points. Along the wall, the crowds were celebrating. In some sectors, people were climbing the wall and dancing on top of it. At some points along the wall, guards sought to prevent such celebration. At other points, they didn't bother. By mid-morning on November 10, 1989, the East German government had totally lost control of its side of the wall. As celebration erupted across Berlin, people began to, on their own initiative, dismantle the wall with sledgehammers, chisels, or whatever other tools they had on hand. Piece by piece, the people of Germany were destroying the most infamous symbol of the Cold War. In the aftermath of the wall coming down, it didn't take long for the East German regime to unravel entirely. Krenz resigned in early December, and the Communist Party opened negotiations with opposition leaders similar to the roundtables that had taken place in Poland and Hungary to give up their monopoly on power and hold free elections. Though at this point, East Germany still remained a separate political entity from West Germany, on March 18, 1990, when the first, last, and only free democratic elections in the history of the German Democratic Republic were held, the people overwhelmingly elected the Christian Democratic Union, the party of West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, on the promise that they would seek reunification with the West. On August 23, 1990, the East German legislature voted to restore the 5 states of East Germany that had been administratively abolished in 1952, and these states independently applied to join the Federal Republic of Germany. These states were officially admitted on October 3, 1990, and East Germany officially ceased to exist. The wider effect of these events on the Soviet Union was perhaps best phrased by the British ambassador to Moscow, Sir Roderick Braithwaite, when he wrote to his superiors in the British Foreign Office on the night the wall fell. Quote, Gorbachev's policy in Eastern Europe is being overrun by events. Gorbachev's problem now is to control the forces that he has unleashed. I do not think the Russians know how to do this. End quote. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, if you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star rating on the platform you're listening on. If you really like the show, you can head over to Patreon and support the show financially by becoming a patron. I have a day job and this isn't my primary source of income, but right now every cent helps, especially considering the uncertain future of my student loan repayment. I'm sure a lot of you are in the same boat right now. If you can afford it, becoming a patron is a great way to help me out and support the show. You can do that at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. A link is also available on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to my streaming platforms, social media, and a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Unfortunately, there will be no new episode in 2 weeks. I will be traveling to Detroit to tend to some family matters, and I don't anticipate that I will be able to record an episode from there. I plan instead to produce a brief patron-only episode and release that on my Patreon. Regularly scheduled programming will resume in 3 weeks, at which point I will cover the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.